Okay. Doug, would you mind turning me down just a bit? I don't know. I feel like I hear myself echoing, and I feel like that might be a little loud. Okay. So we've been studying through the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, chapter 1, chapter 2, have been fairly kind of almost introductory to the relationship between Solomon and the Shulamite girl. Remember, this is a song, okay? So it's being told from the writer's perspective, which is Solomon's. So he's writing this, and he doesn't... There are a few times where Solomon is specifically mentioned, where he mentions himself. But for our purposes, and for really Solomon's purpose for which he writes this, it's representative of the husband and the wife relationship from an eros perspective. This is the sexual desire, the romantic desire that is being expressed in the Song of Solomon, which is pretty unique in the Bible, which is part of the reason why I believe we have the Song of Solomon, to help us to appreciate the blessing that God has given us in this relationship of marriage. So as we have talked through, we've kind of applied the daughters of Jerusalem as being the other wives and concubines of Solomon. That so far that Ben mentioned that several Wednesday nights ago. That's kind of that application has seemed to fit very well as we've gone through this. And in my studies of chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5, I noticed something that I don't know if we made this application the first time through or not, but you'll notice that the king has brought me into his chambers. I mean, there is the sense in which she's already married. Okay, she's describing this love that she has and that he has for her. But it's not necessarily in chronological order from the perspective of the events being described. Because in chapter 3, she's going to look back on her wedding night, okay, before and then after as well. And so it's not necessarily the idea of chronological order, it's describing this love that she has for Solomon and vice versa. And so we need to kind of keep in mind that this is a song describing that love. It's not necessarily a historical, or written for the purpose of historical events in chronological order. Okay, it's a song expressing the love of Solomon and the Shulamite girl, whoever that was. So when we see in verse 5 and 6, she mentions the daughters of Jerusalem. And then we see in verse 7, and this is what I wanted to kind of bring out. Tell me, O you whom I love, and this is the woman speaking to Solomon, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon, for why should I be as one who veils herself, one who wanders? She has to have her veil if she goes out, by the flocks of your companions. And we talked about this, we studied through this, and it's kind of this description of her trying to find him. And I think it's completely accurate, but I've thought more about this imagery, this pastoral imagery, where it's as if he's the shepherd. Well, who is the flock? Because they're mentioned almost routinely throughout the next several chapters. And I'm beginning to wonder if this flock and this picture of him as a shepherd is in relation to also the daughters of Jerusalem. It's just another way of describing his wives and concubines. Because notice how the beloved, we'll talk about the beloved in a second, how the woman, she says, where do you spend your time with them? Is how this would play out, looking at it from this perspective. Why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? I don't want to be with them, I want to be with you. Okay, so where should I go? Where should I be so I can be with you? And then in verse 8 and 9 and 10, where Solomon responds, follow in the footsteps of the flock. Where I go, they go. So you can know where I am. It's not hard for you to figure out. You know where I am, and you can find me. So where they are going, that's where she can go too. Because again, this is the desire that she has for him. And so going on down at the going into chapter 2, then we have a third way in which this group of women, the wives and the concubines of Solomon, are described. So my suggestion, and we'll see if it plays out. So far, I think it fits pretty well. But we have the daughters of Jerusalem, we have the flock, okay, in which Solomon is the shepherd, but now we also have the lilies among the valley. Okay, so remember we talked last week in chapter 2 about how I'm the rose of Sharon, lily of the valleys. She is one of many. To which Solomon replies, like a lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. No, you're one of a kind. You're different than all the others. She is convinced she's just one of all of them. Okay, just one in the mix. So notice the different imagery being described of the plurals here. And I think it seems to fit this consistent consideration of the wives and concubines of Solomon. For some reason, this one stands out to him. So for some reason, he loves her more than anyone else. And again, we talked when we first introduced the Song of Solomon, whether this was an actual love of Solomon's life that simply wasn't recorded for us, or if this was more Solomon's deep desire to actually have a relationship like this. I mean, out of all the wives and concubines, maybe he felt like he didn't really have any one of them that he was particularly close to. And maybe this is kind of the expression of that wish, that he had someone like this. Either way, when we go down to, when we see here in chapter 2, there's still this description of the fact that they seem to be married. Okay, he describes in verse 6, his left hand is under my head, his right hand embraces me, with or without the sexual component of that embrace. That still would not be appropriate behavior if they weren't married at this point. Okay, today nobody would think twice about it, but it's not appropriate, especially in Solomon's time. This would not be appropriate behavior. So when we go down and we see how that she describes her love, we notice the season of spring, and we attached that season of spring in relation to mating. This is kind of this natural course of nature. Really, this is kind of the cycle of nature that's being described, and especially given the different elements that are being described. He is a gazelle, she is a doe, that type of thing that fits that type of imagery. And I did want to notice this, because, and I will note that it is interesting, here in verse 7, we talked about this, do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. And we applied this as, don't bother us in our time together. Okay, don't disturb us. And that does fit in this context. The question is whether or not that is the consistent application of the same phrasing going forward, because this phrase will come up in chapter 5 and in chapter 3. You will see this phrase again, and whether or not it continues to hold that representation or meaning, we'll talk about that. I will say that Garrett, again, this is the two commentaries that seem to kind of, that I'm relying on the most in terms of what I want to share with you guys in terms of what they present. A lot of the other commentaries, again, we talked about the different interpretations of the Song of Solomon. Both Garrett and Zur, they both take a more naturalistic, take it for what it is. It's a song. It's not a play. It's not some kind of an opera. It's not cultic. It's not representative of Jesus and the church. It's just representative of the love of a husband and a wife. Okay? And I've mentioned before, between Zur and Garrett, Zur takes a very literal approach. Garrett takes a very symbolic approach. Much more sexual language Garrett perceives than Zur does. And I love the two of them, because I can kind of, I told you before that I tend to lean more towards the literal when we look at a lot of this, but there are many areas that I do believe are more symbolic that Zur doesn't go along with. So I'm kind of right in the middle between the literal and the symbolic takes on these. So anyway, I mention this because Garrett mentions in verse 7, not to stir up or awaken love until it pleases. His interpretation of this is, don't allow yourselves to become, to let love spring forth, specifically the sexual component of love, until it is appropriate. Okay, which is to say, you wait until you are married to allow that sexual component to enter into the equation. In this particular context, verse 6 and verse 7. I mean, I can kind of see that fitting, I guess. It's kind of a weird way to say that. We talked last time about it. Please don't disturb us, don't bother us. That seems to fit better. However, Garrett's interpretation of that, keep sex within the marriage relationship, don't allow yourselves to fall under some sort of a spell or something like that before you're married. There may be some component to that, like in chapter 5, and we'll notice that in just a minute. But I wanted to kind of pick up on those points because chapter 1 and chapter 2 have been more or less PG, okay? And we've talked before about the explicit language eventually we're going to get into. Chapter 3 and going forward is really kind of where we start getting into the PG-13 and going forward element of it. You read Zur's commentary. Zur is very, very literal in his interpretation of chapter 3, and I disagree with that. And we're going to talk about this from a perspective that keeps track of not just what's being said in context of chapter 1 and chapter 2, okay, because what's being described doesn't have to be chronological. That's how Zur seems to take it, and so he says this is literal. This is what happened. Whereas I tend to think that there's more being said here. So let's start here in verse 1 of chapter 3. By night on my bed I sought the one I love. I sought him, but I did not find him. I will rise now, I said, and go about the city. In the streets and in the squares I will seek the one I love. I sought him, but I did not find him. The watchmen who go about the city found me. I said, have you seen the one I love? Scarcely had I passed by them when I found the one I love. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him to the house of my mother, into the chamber of her who conceived me. Verse 5, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. So here's that phrase again that we talked about earlier in chapter 2. But notice what this situation is. If you look at this from a literal perspective, as Zur does, he perceives this, as Solomon describing, this woman, she wakes up, Solomon's not there, she doesn't seem to know why, so she goes around trying to find him. And Zur seems to think that this is a natural reaction, okay? I want to read you a few excerpts from what Garrett describes here because he puts some historical perspective on this, which I think is very important in this. So he mentions here in commentary, not verse. Okay, so I don't want to get into that quite yet. All right, so the modern Western reader may have difficulty in appreciating how significant this was to the ancient Israelite. He describes verse 3, the guards who encircled the city. As she sought her love, she asks the guard where her beloved is. Her determination to take the groom to her mother's house corroborates this interpretation. This cannot be taken literally. That being the case, and he describes the different issues surrounding this because trying to find the paragraph I want here. Okay, the wandering in the street is most clearly paralleled in Proverbs, in which both Lady Wisdom and the prostitute roam the streets in search of young men. Both figures desire to entice the young man, both good or bad. The desire to entice is not of itself good or evil, since wisdom herself follows this practice. And so this... I cannot find the paragraph that I was wanting. Oh, there we go. Okay. The dream interpretation asserts that none of what is described is reality but a dream. So he describes different interpretations. The actual details of the passage, however, are still confusing if it's a dream interpretation. Why does she meet the guards? Why does she roam the streets? Why is there a parallel sequence to this in chapter 5, verses 2 through 8, in which she is beaten and stripped of her clothes by the guards? To interpret this as a dream is more of an escape than an exegesis. it is most likely the entire sequence is symbolic. And I tend to agree with that as well. If it can be assumed that this is a love song of the wedding of a couple, then the song is at this point moving towards the joining of the bride and the groom. He describes this being the case. This portion is best read as the woman's anxiety about the approaching loss of her virginity. 3 key symbols are operative here: her wandering in the street in search of him, her meeting the guards of the city, her desire to take a man to her mother's house. It is to that, at some point in here, and I'm not finding it yet, but at some point in here, he describes the fact that at this point in time, this would not have been an appropriate reaction for a woman, especially if she's not married yet. Much less at any other time, to arise in the middle of the night, go wandering about the streets. That's not something a woman in ancient Israel, it wouldn't have been appropriate for her to do. Even if she were married, it wouldn't have been appropriate, because what if he's with one of his other wives or concubines? That's not appropriate for her to do. And so looking at it from a literal perspective doesn't seem to be the right fit. If you wanted to go the least bit symbolic, I guess you could look at the entire thing, verses 1 through 5, as I want to be with him. Okay, you could sum it up just like that. I want to be with him, and when I'm not with him, I want to be with him, and I want to find him, and I'm seeking after him. I do tend to agree with Garrett on this. This is a little bit more detailed. Notice, by night on my bed, I sought the one I love. The way the Hebrew addresses this, and Garrett makes mention of this, is that the actual Hebrew terms being used here correspond with at least 2 or 3 other places in the Old Testament where the marriage bed is being considered, which is to say the actual sexual relationship is being, not just a regular bed. It's not just the bed, I'm asleep. It's that sexual component that is being described. I sought him but did not find him. I will rise now and go about the city. In the streets and in the squares I will seek the one I love. I sought him but did not find him. The watchmen who go about the city found me, said, have you seen the one I love? And it's interesting because as Garrett describes this, and the reason I want to read some of this is because he describes it in a way that is actually far better than I can actually put into words. He says, 3 key, we already read that. The wandering in the street is most clearly paralleled in Proverbs. The guardians of the city are in the motif of the authority figure. The city refers to the woman herself. She is lovely as Jerusalem, as in chapter 6, verse 4. For the woman, the guardians represent her virginity. The modern Western reader may have difficulty in appreciating how significant this was to the ancient Israelite. The law provided on penalty of death that a woman must maintain proof that she was a virgin at marriage. A priest could marry only a virgin, Leviticus chapter 21. In commemorating Jephthah's daughter, Judges chapter 11 points out that she was a virgin, and 1 Kings chapter 1 specifically mentions that David's servants found a virgin to warm him and that he had no sexual relations with her. The Israelite girl approached the day of losing her virginity with considerable anxiety. The Song of Songs, because it deals with the emotions of love and the wedding day, naturally deals with this as well. So verse 3 describes the guards who encircle the city as they found her as she sought her beloved. Her mind is focused on wanting to be with him, but she can't yet. So when we talked earlier about the chronological order, chapters 1 and chapter 2 seems to describe them, they are married, they're already together. Chapter 3 is as if she's thinking back to that time of both anxiety and excitement. Okay? Because this was a monumental day, granted, for a man, but in particular for a woman, because of the virginity factor. And so she describes this in a symbolic phrase. And I tend to think that there's legitimacy to this approach. In verse 3, or on the other hand, we see in verse 3, have you seen the one I love? She asks the guards where her beloved is. No answer, of course, is given. The point is that she seeks her beloved through the very same authorities who separate her from her beloved. So the fact of her virginity, and they're not married yet, this authority and the means by which she can have him and he can have her, both will serve to unite them, but at the moment serves to separate them. And she is both anxious and looking forward to this time where that's the prevention of them being together is no longer there. Her determination to take the groom to her mother's house. And this is one of the points that really kind of convinced me with regard to the literal versus the symbolic. Her determination to take the groom to her mother's house corroborates this interpretation. As mentioned earlier, this cannot be taken literally. That being the case, the mother's house, the room of the one who conceived me, and we see this here in verse 4, I held him, would not let him go until I had brought him to the house of my mother, into the chamber of her who conceived me, must represent the idea of the womb. This is the room in which all are conceived. The bride is drawing strength from the fact that her mother also has gone through this experience, and that indeed she owes her very existence to her mother's surrender of her virginity to her father. The bride, therefore, has anxieties and misgivings about the loss of her virginity and reflects this in her song. Note that she meets him immediately after her encounter with the guards, representative of the marriage ceremony. They're now married. Now she can be with him. And that's what's being symbolized there. What he mentions earlier in the paragraph I can't find, and I don't know why, is the fact that, there it is. The most significant objection to the literal interpretation is the inherent peculiarity of what is described. First, it would be very strange for a girl in ancient Israel to wander the streets at night because she misses her boyfriend, presumably because they're not married yet. Even if they were, that's still strange. Girls in ancient societies were fairly cloistered. A girl wandering the streets at night might well be taken as a prostitute. We see that in Proverbs chapter 7, Hosea chapter 2. It is also difficult to see her taking her boyfriend to her mother's house for a sexual liaison. That doesn't fit whatsoever. A woman was taken into the man's household at marriage. It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that the man was taken to the woman's household. It was the other way. This is not to be understood as outside of marriage, since taking the man to her parents' home for that purpose would be unthinkable in Israelite society. So it's important to remember, especially from that perspective, that it does seem as if this is major symbolic language that doesn't fit for it to be literal, especially in the times of Solomon. That just doesn't seem to fit. Given the fact that we've already had imagery of the gazelle, which represents Solomon, of the doe, which represents the Shulamite girl, the imagery of springtime, which represents the time in which they can be together in a sexual manner, this seems to fit that type of thought process that is describing this anxiety and at the same time excitement from this woman. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does. Notice that symbolism still being there. She's not calling on literal animals. She's describing the course of nature. Okay, this is what's being described all the time with the gazelles and the does in Song of Solomon. It is the course of nature between a husband and a wife. Do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. And again, Garrett holds to this idea that this is, don't allow, in essence, he says, don't allow your virginity to be taken and then ruining your opportunity at this holy covenant between a husband and a wife. Okay? Because nobody's going to marry someone who's not a virgin. And so that description, I can understand in this context, but I still wonder, especially given the fact that she's describing this whole process of wanting to be with her husband, or wanting to be with Solomon, but she can't because they're not married yet. And then she walks in the squares, she seeks the one she loves, she can't find him, then she finds the watchman, okay, representative of the authority of the law. And through that authority of the law, she's able to find the one she loves and be with him and bring him to herself. Thus, verse 5, do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Whether or not the meaning of this phrase changes from chapter 2 here to chapter 3, or if it still maintains its meaning. I mean, I can still see it fitting in that mindset of don't disturb us. Because again, she's describing this process of marriage and the wedding night. Don't disturb us. But the fact that she's calling on the daughters of Jerusalem, again, we're applying this as the wives and the concubines. Again, I tend to hold to the fact that this is, don't disturb that which is holy, that which has been placed by God as a blessing. Because, again, many of those wives and concubines wouldn't necessarily have to be virgins. Okay, they could have already spent time with Solomon, and as a result, it wouldn't apply in that perspective at the end of verse 5. It wouldn't fit in that context. So I still tend to think that the stirring up or awakening love until it pleases, until we have had our time together, don't bother us. I'm still going to hold fast to that until or unless I find something that seems to contradict that. Okay? Now, I know that that's heavy symbolism, and I tend to shy away from heavy symbolism simply because it's hard to fit every single piece of anything into something symbolic. And that's a difficult process to take. That's why I tend to shy away from a lot of what Garrett tends to think. But having said that, this particular point, I do tend to agree is symbolic. It just doesn't seem to fit in a literal sense. Does anybody have thoughts or comments on that? Because verses 1 through 5, they're being spoken by the woman, so there has to be some purpose or reasoning behind it, and it doesn't have to correlate to the context of chapter 1 and chapter 2. That's one of the things that Zur mentions, is that chapter 1 and chapter 2, Solomon and the Shulamite girl seem to already be married. So how can we take a symbolic view of the wedding night if they're already married? And that's why I suggest it doesn't have to be chronological. It's a song. She's thinking back on. This is when I was excited and anxious, and then the wedding night, and she's describing that love. That's what the song's about. So I tend to think that the symbolism it fits. It does. It fits. Any thoughts or comments on that? Yes, sir.
A quick thought would be if 1 through 4 is symbolic, then why don't we turn to verse 5 and it be back to a literal, don't wake up, my love, in a literal sense, as you suggested.
Yeah.
Don't disturb us kind of statement. Why would he switch back? Why would the speaker switch back?
Well,
symbolic to a literal.
Right. Right. And I tend to think, because it seems like verse 5, she switches it's almost like she's switching who she's directing her song to. Okay. Earlier, it doesn't sound like there's any reference to, she's not speaking to the daughters of Jerusalem, verses 1 through 4. Now, verse 5, it's as if she turns and speaks to the other wives and concubines, and it's the exact same phrasing as chapter 2. So it's almost like almost like what we would call a chorus line, except it's being sung by her. And there's still some symbolism. You've got the gazelles and the does of the field. I don't see that being literal whatsoever, or the daughters of Jerusalem. So the stirring up or awakening love until it pleases, again, the fitting of the context in chapter 2 seemed to suggest that was the case. How would you perceive this, given the symbolism of it, if that's the case? How would you perceive verse 5? If it's not literal, what would be the symbolism there?
I think it's the same as what he suggested throughout the whole of the book. That's my personal view.
Of Zur, the literal interpretation?
No, that this is what the commentator that you suggested.
Oh, Garrett, yep.
That there's a time and place for love.
Okay.
Don't engage in that until it's the appropriate time.
Okay.
That's what I think it is throughout. It doesn't say don't stir up or awaken my love until he pleases. It says don't stir up or awaken love till it pleases.
Yeah.
I think that's referring to love in general. I mean,
The appropriateness of love. Okay. All right.
That's from my studies a long time ago. That's my view of it.
Okay.
I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just,
And that could very well be. I mean, when you go back to chapter 2, we looked at that just a minute ago. When you go back to chapter 2, I can see that, the context could go either way on that. So whether or not the meaning is changing or it stays consistent, but at the same time, the idea of don't allow this sexual relationship to exist before marriage, it can fit in chapter 2 also. It fits in chapter 5 as well. It fits here. And as you mentioned, the greater view or overarching view of the Song of Solomon is emphasizing the blessing and the beauty of this relationship within the appropriate realm of marriage. Okay, it is not appropriate outside of marriage. That is the perverting of what God has given us. So certainly that I can see that there. So whether or not she's speaking this, she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, whether this is all the virgins that she mentioned earlier in chapter 1, or this would also include the wives and concubines, perhaps. I don't know how they would fit into that frame of O daughters of Jerusalem, because there are times where O daughters of Jerusalem seems to be the wives and the concubines. But if that's the case here in verse 5, that it's that awakening love is, as Joe described, then the daughters of Jerusalem would be all of the virgins of Jerusalem. And then that may be. That may be. Any other thoughts and comments through verse 5? Okay. So, verse 6, interestingly enough, we have the woman and the daughters of Jerusalem, for that matter, are observing Solomon as he's approaching the city. Zer, once again, takes this very literally. He really thinks they're seeing Solomon approaching the city. Who is this coming out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the merchants' fragrant powders? Behold, it is Solomon's couch, with 60 valiant men around it, of the valiant of Israel. They all hold swords, being expert in war. Every man has his sword on his thigh because of fear in the night. Of the wood of Lebanon, Solomon the king made himself a palanquin. He made its pillars of silver, its support of gold, its seat of purple, its interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O daughters of Zion, and see King Solomon with the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, the day of the gladness of his heart. So, we see this approaching of Solomon in the splendor of a king, okay? And as I mentioned, Zer takes a literal approach to this, but there seems to be a slight disconnect, if that's the case, if it is literal, between verse 5 and verse 6. Okay, verses 1 through 4, she's seeking him, then she finds him, but now all of a sudden he's out in the wilderness and approaching Jerusalem. Once again, I tend to agree with Garrett on this, that this is more symbolism describing some elements of the wedding and the aspects of what Solomon and how she describes him, of the characteristics of Solomon. Who is this coming out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke? That wilderness, some translations read desert. It is appropriately wilderness. Wilderness isn't the same as desert. Okay, I think a lot of times it gets misused to represent desert, but wilderness actually simply means there's no people there. Okay, wilderness in most cases, in fact, represents the opposite of the desert. It's very lush, very green. And notice the pillars of smoke, the representation of this flowing, okay, not literal pillars of smoke, but the flowing nature in which he and his entourage are coming to Jerusalem. That's how massive this entourage is. Perfumed with myrrh and frankincense and all the merchants' fragrant powders. He's out in the wilderness. They see him coming, but they can smell him. See, again, it lends itself to more symbolism describing the desirable nature. Okay, the desirable nature that is Solomon as the desire she has for him as a husband. Behold, it is Solomon's couch with 60 valiant men, the valiant of Israel. There's nothing necessarily symbolic of the number 60, so much as it is representative of the power and might and security that Solomon represents. Because if Solomon's out in the wilderness somewhere and he's coming to Jerusalem, I'm pretty sure he'd have more than 60 soldiers with him. Okay, I would assume that would be a very small group of men to guard the king. Yeah, so this idea of 60 men seems to represent this idea of strength, of security, of bravery. They all hold swords, being expert in war. Every man has his sword on his thigh because of fear in the night. He's there to protect her. He's there to take care of her, to guard her is the idea. The fact that as long as she's with him, nothing can harm her. The wood of Lebanon, he describes, does anybody know what a palanquin is? Sorry? Okay, it's like a carriage. I'm trying to think, there have been several movies in which a palanquin is depicted. Sorry? Yeah, you know how the kings, they sit in that big throne, but it's carried by people, and they have this roof on top of it. It's kind of like a throne carriage type thing, right? That's a palanquin, okay? So he's being carried in this great throne that has this covered cloth roof. Notice how she describes the wood of Lebanon is what comprises this palanquin. The pillars of it are silver, the support of gold, the seat of purple, that's the throne part, its interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. That's interesting to me because all these other are very physical elements that comprise an actual palanquin or throne. It's being carried, and you get the sense of the luxury, the sense of wealth, okay, the sense of providing that Solomon represents to a wife. But then notice this last part where he says the interior is paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. Love isn't an element. I mean, it's not a physical, tangible thing you can build something with. So what do you think, why do you think love is a part of this representation of his palanquin? And again, it's not a literal palanquin, it's describing Solomon. So what do you think all of this is about? What's his palanquin supposed to represent? He's being carried. This is the representation of his wealth, and it's inlaid with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. What do you think that could be a reference to? I tend to think, verse 10, because again, we're describing characteristics of Solomon. We're not describing characteristics of his palanquin, okay? Because his palanquin is representative of what's being lifted up, what's being exalted. And I tend to think when you look at verse 10, these characteristics of Solomon, and all of this from verse 6 on, the interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem, these characteristics that are so desirable in Solomon from the daughters of Jerusalem, from the virgins. That's why the virgins love him, chapter 1. This interior paved with love, that which is within him, is so desirable. And I tend to think this speaks more to not just how he looks, how he smells, or what comes with him in terms of strength and security and wealth, but also the character that he has. Okay, this character of the wisdom that is involved, the interior paved with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. This is what they see. And they see the love he has within. The love that they're able to bring out of him, if we're looking at it from the wives and the concubines' perspective, they're able to bring out that romantic side of him, that sexual side of him. And so that idea of them paving it is describing them bringing out that character from him. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll pick up here in verse 10 and 11. We don't have much left here in chapter 3. We'll get into chapter 4 next week. If you, over the course of the week, if you have some thoughts, you read through that and think, hey, I wonder if it could be, maybe even more specific than this. Or, if you have any thoughts, we'll address them next week. Thank you for the thoughts and comments.